Judges, will you please introduce yourselves?
Let me try that again. Good afternoon. My name is Tandy McConnell. I am going to be your lead judge for this round. I spent about 20 years as a professor of history at Columbia College in South Carolina. Then I decided to do something really different and useful with my life. And right now I'm teaching high school history here in South Carolina. So I am delighted and honored to be here with you guys. We are your Unit 1 judges, and I hope you're the Unit 1 team. It always works out well when it happens that way, but I'll ask my fellow judges to introduce themselves.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Mariam Mamar Sadeghi. I participated in We the People the first year it was offered, long time ago, on the bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. I've been involved with civic education for a large part of my career. I have found ways to provide education, civic education opportunities to people living in Iran, which is where I'm originally from. I serve on the board of the Center for Civic Education also. So glad to be with you.
All right, I am Michael DePiero. I work with the Florida Department of Education here in Tallahassee, Florida. So we do share a common border. So welcome aboard.
Would you introduce yourselves and your teacher, please?
Hi, my name is Audrey Bain. We're from Vestavia Hills High School, and this fall I will be attending the University of Alabama and majoring in political science and public health.
Hi, I'm Kenneth Lowe. I'll be attending Virginia Tech studying computer science.
Hi, my name is Reed Smith. I will also be attending Virginia Tech and also be studying computer science. Our teacher is Miss Amy Maddox, and we're super excited to be here today.
And we're excited to be with you. I'm just curious. We're starting to get thunderstorms here in South Carolina and Florida. Did you guys have those yesterday?
I think we're supposed to have them today, so that will be interesting.
So we are in a common weather pattern there. It's always kind of interesting when we're talking together far apart. Let me get make sure I'm reading the right question here. Well, then let's get started. We are Unit 1. We're interested in the philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system. We're going to be asking about question 1. The American War is over, so says Benjamin Rush, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times? And please begin.
Thank you. In Federalist 51, James Madison asked, "What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?" The United States' first exercise in constitution making was the Articles of Confederation, but it hamstrung the government's ability to act meaningfully, as the Confederation Congress could neither lay taxes or regulate commerce. The fear of British oppression led the founders to initially create an extremely weak and inefficient government. Later, the framers sought to strike a balance between the weak articles and the tyrannical British reign. The Constitution was heavily influenced by revolutionary principles and beliefs. Popular sovereignty shaped both the drafting and ratification of the Constitution, as the people elected representatives to debate ratification in special conventions. The revolutionary phrase, "no taxation without representation," was incorporated into the Constitution through the House's exclusive ability to initiate revenue bills and the direct popular election of House members. Limited government was included in Article 1, Section 9, which explicitly denies Congress powers the colonists had argued against in the Declaration of Independence. The founders went on to protect natural rights through the Bill of Rights, which defends life, liberty, and property with Amendments 4 through 8.
Just as the Bill of Rights protected natural freedoms, the amendment process was designed to preserve public consent for any future constitutional changes. Thomas Jefferson argued the Constitution needed to be reconsidered every 19 years to ensure that the earth belonged to the living and not the dead. He believed the government must have the explicit consent of the governed to function, as limited government must draw its power from the people. The supermajority requirement of 3/4 of the states for ratification has resulted in only 27 amendments being added over 230 years. Popular amendments like the Equal Rights Amendment have been stymied because opponents grouped in a few states can deny ultimate passage. For over 200 years, American commitment to popular sovereignty, limited government, and natural rights has persisted. Popular sovereignty has expanded over time through the 15th, 17th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments. Though the government has greatly increased in size and power since the founding, an American belief in limited government endures. America does not have a king. Both wings of Congress and the president are elected and must prove every few years that they can responsibly wield the great power given to them by the people. The natural rights Jefferson spelled out in the Declaration of Independence hold strong today, like in the 2020 Supreme Court case Ramos v. Louisiana, which requires all guilty verdicts in criminal cases to be unanimous, a direct defense of liberty.
The First Amendment is essential to furthering and protecting the revolutionary principle of public demonstrations and protests. People are able to fight for what they believe in without spilling blood, like with the passage of the 19th Amendment that protected half the population's right to vote. The First Amendment also protects the choice to boycott, a clear reflection of the American Colonist Stamp Act boycotts in 1765. However, revolutionary principles can be corrupted by those who do not appreciate the ideological context or initial restraint shown by American revolutionaries. Although American colonists eventually went to war with Britain, they made several attempts to peacefully resolve problems such as protests, boycotts, and the eventual Olive Branch petition. Some violent factions have mistakenly claimed that they are the true heirs to the revolutionaries. Those that stormed the Capitol building on January 6th claimed that they were similarly overthrowing a tyrannical government, but they instantly resort to violence before trying to peacefully alter rather than abolish the government. Ultimately, the revolutionary spirit of '76 has survived times of war and has steadfastly remained a feature of the American identity. Revolutionary ideas still permeate through our society, helping to hold the government accountable and protect against injustice. Thank you. We are now ready for your questions.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful presentation. Raise some questions for me as you, I'm sorry, let me get my notes together. We talked about the consent of the governed. One of the problems that there always raises is that of the tyranny of the majority. I think you talked a little bit about the tyranny of the minority with the, in some ways. Are we protected anyway from an overweening majority that might seek to dispose of the rights of minorities?
So I think we can look at all the Madisonian filters that are built into our government. In the amendment process in Article 5, you have 3/4 of the states to ratify amendments. That is such a high margin, and pretty much most of the people in every state have to say, we definitely think this is where the country should go to pass an amendment to change the fundamental structure of the Constitution.
Additionally, I'd argue that the courts serve as a way to prevent the tyranny of the majority, because we have 9 justices who can counteract the acts of Congress as an independent body.
Let me ask you one follow-up question then. Which do you see as the greater danger, a tyranny of a majority that seeks to oppress minorities, or a tyranny of a minority that seeks to stymie the will of a majority?
I think that you can argue both can be detrimental in their own ways. As my colleague said, there are protections in place to prevent the majority party from being tyrannical, but there are also protections in place to prevent the minority party from creating factions and ultimately hurting the government.
Great, thank you so much. Reed, did you have something else to say?
I would just say personally, I believe that tyranny of the majority is much higher of a danger. We see throughout American history with the civil rights movement, where especially in the South, where you had a large portion of the white Americans there who really stomped on the constitutional rights that African Americans were guaranteed from the 14th Amendment, the 15th. And so I think in that way, that's a much more pressing issue, much more likely to happen.
Thank you. Michael, would you take it from here?
So when we're through the lens of consent to the governed, when we're looking at 27 amendments to the United States Constitution over the course of 230 something years, Is this an example of the system working as designed or a flaw in the system?
I would say that having 27 amendments is obviously a very, very low number considering our country has been around for about 230 years. On the other end of that spectrum, our state's constitution, the Alabama state constitution, has almost 1,000 amendments, and it is the longest constitution. It's longer than any country's constitution, longest state constitution. And I think that shows that there are people that argue that the amendment process should be easier and we should lower the 3/4 requirement. But if you look at the opposite end with a place like Alabama, that also creates problems for the government. So I would say that although you can argue that 27 amendments isn't as many as it could be, I think it's a good number considering how high the threshold is.
I think the supermajority requirement of amendments is a good thing for our government um, because we want to promote stability in our government. And like Audrey mentioned, Alabama state constitution has 1,000 amendments, and I think that too much change can lead to instability and create worries within our government. So I think that having a really strict amendment process actually helps our government because it stays stable.
But I also think you can look at, on the other end of this spectrum, I would push back against my teammates. And I would say, look at the ERA. Phyllis Schlafly and her group of conservative women were able to really protest and stop the ERA from becoming an amendment, even though it was very popular in most other states, because they were so grouped in the South. And in that way, the amendment process of 3/4 of the states might be actually too high. Personally, I would say maybe we could lower it to still a supermajority of 2/3, which just like in the Senate to override a veto of the president, I think that is still a supermajority requirement that is useful. And
All right. What about civil disobedience? What do you guys think about when people come out and protest? Is that related to expressing consent? Or do you see it as outside of the democratic process?
I would say it's definitely a part of the democratic process. It's why we have our First Amendment rights to assembly and protest and free speech.
Okay, what about though if it's not civil and it becomes violent? As we did see that some of the protests about racial justice have become violent. What about that?
I think that breaks a line of civil disobedience, and I think civil disobedience becomes different when we bring in violence into the question, whether it's violence against property or violence against lives, as we saw in the January 6th riots.
I think in protests, people they say, we're revoking our consent because we feel the government is not properly upholding our constitutional rights we are guaranteed. So they're saying that, yeah, John Locke's whole idea of the social contract is a little broken because the government isn't upholding what they promised that they would do. So in this way, we're revoking our consent by protesting and saying that we will not assent to your laws until you make this change, until you make this constitutional protections.
Okay. So when before women in the United States had the right to vote or African Americans had the right to vote, would you have supported their protest if it was not civil and if it was violent?
I think violent protests, I think they cross the line between civil disobedience because if they become violent and you're starting to destroy people's property or even people's lives, I think that infringes upon their rights enough to life, liberty, and as John Locke said, property. I think it can become a real problem when you're hurting other people's rights by trying to advance your own. So I think there's a really good balance right there that needs to happen with civil disobedience versus a violent protest.
I'd also like to add that if we're supporting violent protests, even if it's behind a good cause, this sets a really bad image about the other peaceful protesters, and it really degrades from the issue at large. And I think it sets a bad precedent for the future. And I think if we allow more violent protests now, then we allow more violent protests in the future, which sets a really bad precedence and example for us.
One real quick question. Does the federal system help or hinder the idea of the consent of the governed?
I think it definitely helps. Our federalism really brings the government closer to the people. Sorry, may I
Finish
continue
your
my thought?
sentence, please.
Thank you. State and local governments are much closer to the people in those states than they are to the federal government.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Great. Let's see, I've got it. No, great conversation. I really appreciated the examples you gave. You provided a thesis. You supported it with very solid examples of popular sovereignty, of limited government, of the problems that those raise for us. I like the idea of a Madisonian filter. That's not a phrase I've heard before, but I think that fits exactly with what Madison's trying to do. How do we maintain the balance between these competing interests of majorities, interests of minorities, and the desire both to maintain that revolutionary spirit without the revolution devouring its own children. So wonderful conversation, wonderful discussion. Thanks so much.
So I'll just echo that. And I really appreciate the balance you all showed in your responses. I definitely saw a spectrum of responses to the same principle, which shows the nuance and complexities within the questions. So thank you.
I agree with my colleagues. You have a lot to be proud of, and your willingness to say what you think. You have the knowledge, you have the logical reasoning, you have the capacity to look at other texts, but this stuff is really dead if you don't bring yourself into it. This is all about the country that we're living in now and our responsibility as citizens to it. And that starts with thinking, what do I think about this? What do I want for my country? What do I think about when protests turn violent? Is that going to help anything or not? And I found your responses to be genuine. You have a lot to be proud of. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
we would
you.
like to commend you all on a job well done, and thank you for participating today. Good job. Thank you.